pray. Blessed Jesus, blessed Jesus, hear, oh hear us when we pray. Early let us seek thy favor, early let us do thy will. Blessed Lord and only Savior, with thy love our bosoms fill. Blessed Jesus, blessed Jesus, thou hast loved us, love us still. Blessed Jesus, blessed Jesus, thou hast loved us, love us still. Number 384, 384. The Lily of the Valley. I have found a friend in Jesus, he's everything to me. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. The lily of the valley, in him alone I see all I need to cleanse and make me fully whole. In sorrow he's my comfort, in trouble he's my stay. He tells me every care on him to roll. He's a lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. Oh, he all my griefs has taken, and all my sorrows borne. In temptation he's my strong and mighty tower. I have all for him forsaken, and all my idols torn from my heart, and now he keeps me by his power. Though all the world forsake me, and Satan tempt me sore, through Jesus I shall quickly reach the goal. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. He will never, never leave me, nor yet forsake me here, while I live by faith and do his blessed will. A wall of fire about me, I've nothing now to fear. With his manna he my hungry soul shall fill. Then sweeping up to glory, to see his blessed face, where rivers of delight shall ever roll. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. Mike Mark 744 will be our closing song. Chad, would you lead us a word of prayer, please?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this glorious day that you've given to us, and for the sunshine and for the rain that we've had recently. And we thank you for this time that you've allowed us to come together as a Christian family so that we can sing songs of praise to you and study your good word. We ask that as we go through this time of study and worship, that you be with us, that you guide our hearts and open them so that we can take the messages that you've given to us and apply them so that we can become better Christians and walk more in your light. We ask that you be with Wade tonight as he teaches us, and we thank you mostly for your Son, Jesus Christ, that through him we all have the hope of eternal salvation. We ask all this in his name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, we'll see how this goes. We're having... All right, good. It's always good when I click and the first slide comes up. So good to see everybody tonight. Last week we talked about the rebuilding of the temple in the first part of the book of Ezra. And as the historical account goes, now it's not clicking. Oh boy. Oh, lost the connection again. It's going to be one of those nights. Got it back. There we go. As we talked about last week, Cyrus, who's the king of Persia, sends 50,000 Jews back to rebuild the temple. And the Persian government not only sent them back, but they also provided provided them some materials, and they also sent back with the Jews what was left of all of the utensils and various articles from the temple that Babylon had emptied out and brought back to Babylon with them. The people also took up a collection in order to build that second temple. They started the work by laying the foundation, but they ran into some resistance, and that plus it looks like maybe a couple of other factors led them to give up partway through the project. So the temple sat unfinished for a decade or more. And it's at the prompting of Haggai and Zechariah, the two prophets are sent basically to get the people motivated again, and they get the work resumed. They finish the temple around 516 BC. I was listening to somebody today talking about history, and they're like, don't worry about the dates don't matter. Don't worry about the names don't matter. Just get the big picture. And I understand that, but some people actually do like dates, and some people do like names, so I'm trying to please everyone, which is usually a bad idea. Anyways, so we're getting into talking about what history calls the Achaemenid Empire, also known as the Persian Empire. I just threw that name up there because sometimes you might run across that name, like on Wikipedia, for example. If you ever type in Persian, you might see that really weird word, and you're wondering where that come from. Well, that's what history calls this era of the Persian Empire. And of course, this empire was predicted in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, verse 39. So the head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. After Nebuchadnezzar passes away, the empire of Babylon falls very, very quickly and is conquered by the Persians. But the Persians have in some respects, a very admirable kingdom, but there is weakness built within. It's inferior to what Babylon produced. The Persian Empire was represented by silver chests, a chest and arms, right? Silver is a valuable metal. It's less valuable than gold, and that kind of fits with what Daniel says about the Persian Empire. It's not as good as the Babylonian Empire. And as we work our way down that image, you'll recall that each one of those metals gets a little bit less valuable. Now, we're not going to talk about the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, because by the time that happens, the Old Testament is complete. The book of Malachi is written sometime in the 400s BC, so we won't have any occasion really to talk about Alexander the Great unless we want to look at some prophecies in the book of Daniel, particularly in chapter 8, that have to do with the rise of the Greek kingdom. Anyway, so as you work your way down the image there in Daniel chapter 2, each metal gets a little less valuable, and the body parts become a little less valuable as well, right? I would say that in our body, probably the two most valuable organs are our brain and our heart. I don't know. You could probably make an argument for both. I'm not going to sit up here and have that debate because that seems like a real rabbit to chase, but it seems like probably the brain's the most important organ, I'm guessing, and then you just work your way down. So as you work your way down the body, each part is less valuable as well. So the silver equals the Medes and the Persians, as you may recall from that story about Belshazzar, the final king of Babylon. Daniel tells him that very night his kingdom would be handed over to the Medes and the Persians. And this begins as an empire of two peoples, the Medes and the Persians, which, if you think about it, two arms that are joined together by a chest. That makes some sense symbolically. So 536, this is when Cyrus the Great, 538, pardon me, Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon. He installs Darius the Mede as his viceroy. And we talked about Daniel chapter 5, verse 31, and some of all that to do. So that kind of sets us up for what we talked about last week. We get into this whole idea of the temple rebuilding. 536 BC, Cyrus sends back 50,000 Jews. Construction resumes in 520 BC under the reign of Darius the First. Now, I do want you to remember that name because that name is going to have some bearing on our lesson tonight. So, under Darius the First, the construction of the temple resumes. The construction is complete in 516 BC. And I don't know if we talked about this last week. I think this may have slipped off of my radar, but I wanted to bring this out one more time. Remember in Jeremiah prophesies that this period of captivity, this period of exile, is going to last 70 years. And it just so happens that the first wave of Jews is taken back to Babylon in 606 BC, and lo and behold, 70 years later, the first wave of Jews is sent back by Cyrus the Great. So you've got 70 years there. Now, here's a really cool one. The temple is destroyed in 586 BC, and when is the temple complete? 516 BC. So, see, sometimes dates do matter a little bit, right? So you've got 70 years in both cases. 70 years when the first wave was taken away and the first wave was sent back, and 70 years from when the temple was destroyed to when the temple was rebuilt. All right, so the Persian Empire is the big kid on the block, and they are quite large. So this is a pretty good map. You know, maps are kind of hard because sometimes maps can be difficult to read. I don't know if you've ever noticed it. Maybe you haven't spent any time, like I do, looking for good maps that are easy to read. This one I thought was pretty good. So you can see the Persian Empire stretches clear over into India and as far west as the area that we would call the Balkans here on the Black Sea, and then clear over here to Libya in modern-day Libya in Africa. So it's a very large empire, quite a bit larger than the Babylonians, which their empire was basically the Fertile Crescent. So Persia is quite big, and that's going to be a part of our story this evening, because there's going to be a comment about how large the Persian Empire was during the reign of Ahasuerus, as he's called. Now, the Persian Empire was great. There's no denying that. One of the great world empires. But as Daniel alluded to in that prophecy, it was a flawed empire. We're going to see those flaws actually come out in the story of Esther. So it's a great empire under Cyrus, but it begins to decay under a Persian emperor by the name of Xerxes I. And he's going to be a major character in the account of Esther this evening. The reason why the Persian Empire began to degrade was because they were ruled by terrible emperors. The kings of Persia were the worst race of men that ever governed an empire, said Prideaux in his Connections. And that seems to be a general consensus, that once you get past the first few Persian emperors, you get just a bunch of stinkers. And that's the reason why the empire begins to fall off the map. And one of the other things that makes Persia such a flawed nation, and this factors into our story tonight as well. If you're wondering, why are we talking about Persia so much? I'm setting up parts of the story of Esther this evening. One of the other things that makes Persia such a flawed empire was they were known more for their monumental military losses than they were their great victories. You think Rome and you think great military victories. You think Persia, and the first thought that should come to mind is, how did they lose all those battles? It's quite stunning, really. So the mistake Persia made is they decided to pick a fight with the Greek city-states. And if you know anything about Greek history, you know that Greece has a long and proud tradition in the ancient world of great military prowess. Of course, you think of Sparta, which is renowned, but all of the Greek city-states, all the major ones, were known as great military powers. Persia decides to pick a fight with the Greeks, and you can see why. You can see the outlines of the Persian Empire right through here, right? They're coming right up on the lands that the Greeks have always considered their own. Now, you think Greece, and you think this part over here. That's the country we call Greece. But in the ancient world, the Greeks thought of their territory as not only that part, but stretching all the way over here
to the west coast of what we call Turkey. In their minds, that is Greek territory. And there were quite a lot of fights between the Turks and the Greeks when the Turks came in. Of course, the Turks are the ones who conquered Constantinople in 1453, and the Greeks and the Turks were always at each other's throats, really for centuries. All right, so the Greeks thought of the west coast of Turkey as their own. The Persians are pushing into that territory, and the Persians decide they're going to pick a war with the Greeks. They basically decide that these city-states of Asia Minor, Turkey, notably Ionia, need to be conquered. They want to subjugate these Greek territories. And King Darius launches multiple invasions into the Greek homeland, the actual place we call Greece. He is able to, he has some success, but he ends up losing to the Athenians at this battle, the Battle of Marathon. And the reason why that is pertinent is because of what's going to happen in tonight's story. Darius I is succeeded by Xerxes I, which brings us to the book of Esther. And all of this does play a part in the background of the book of Esther. So let's open up in chapter 1 and look at verses 1 through 5. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Do you remember that map of the Persian Empire? It's massive, right? Huge empire. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces, being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. All right, so you're the king. What do you want to do? Well, you want to celebrate how great you are, right? It's like what's happening over in Russia right now. You all heard about these parades that are happening in Moscow because, today is Victory in Europe Day, right? Victory in Europe Day. And of course, we're 80 years after that victory in Europe. And that's a bigger deal in Russia than it tends to be in Europe and the United States, and they go all out, and they have these military parades, and they have their men marching, and they got their military gear out there. It's the same sort of idea, right? When you're the king, you kind of want people to be impressed, right? So you got this festival, you're showing off all of your wealth, and then you have a feast for 7 days. So Shushan in the Bible is actually the city of Susa. Now, I bring this up because sometimes the Hebrew names for locations and people are different than the names we've received. A lot of times, sometimes I should say, the names that we get in this part from ancient history have come to us typically from the Greeks. A lot of Greek historians, they ended up being the source material for some of our early understanding of this part of the world. So some of these names come to us from the Greek language. But in this case, the Bible calls Susa Shushan, but it's the same city. I thought I'd throw in a few pictures of what's left of Susa. Not John Phillip, but Susa, the city of Susa, right?
I was actually thinking.
Yeah. El Capitan, right? Yes. Here's a statue. I'm not sure what this is. This looks like it might have been a horse at one time. Does that kind of look like a horse, maybe? Maybe a lion? I'm not sure. Yeah, it could be a lion. Yeah, I can see a lion in there too. Yep. Yeah, this is a remnant of a statue in the palace of Susa. And here's some of the palace, what little is left of the palace that Darius I built. So this would be the father of Xerxes. And this picture on the right here, this is kind of an interesting picture. Let me pull up my notes here so I get the description correct. So I don't know how well you can see this, but so I think this is the head of a soldier right here, and this is his back. This right here is a quiver for arrows. I don't know how discernible that is to you, but this is glazed brick. It's from the east gate of the palace at Susa. This came from the reign of Darius I. So this is depicting a member of the royal guard, what are called the Immortals. These were 1,000 special royal guards. Think of them like special operations, like, I don't know, Delta Force, Navy SEALs, those kind of guys, right? They were the great warriors of the time. So I'm just giving you a little bit of flavor there. Sorry, I backed out of that on accident. Hopefully that didn't affect you. So we're introduced to this guy by the name of Ahasuerus, and as you probably have noticed, I've not really mentioned him by names when I'm talking about all of the Persian emperors. Well, the same thing I said about Susa and Shushan applies in this case as well. The Bible calls him Ahasuerus, but he's actually Xerxes the First. So Xerxes the First reigns from 485 to 465. And there is some discrepancy out there that I just want to bring to your attention, because if you've got Bible notes in your Bible, you might run across this. So I want to give just a really quick explanation. There's some confusion out there, at least with some of the older commentaries. They thought Ahasuerus was actually Artaxerxes, who is the guy who comes after Xerxes. And the reason they thought that is because Artaxerxes is the name mentioned in the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is a translation. It's a translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. They apparently got this one incorrect in their translation. They render this as Artaxerxes. But actually, if you do a little bit of digging, and this is going to be a paragraph that I'm not going to even try to pronounce some of these names, but upon a little bit closer examination, what you learn is that Ahasuerus is phonetically similar to the old Persian name, I'm not going to even try that, okay, which in Greek was written as Xerxes. So here's what's happened. You have a Persian name, and the Hebrews took that Persian name and they Hebraized it, okay? But then the Greeks, they had their own name for this particular king. They called him Xerxes. And that's how we know him. We know him by the Greek name Xerxes. But this is what happens when you start translating languages and borrowing names from one language to the other. It just doesn't always work out as neatly and cleanly. So you have the Persian name that goes into the Hebrew name, and then you've got the Greek or English name for Xerxes. So it's pretty clear that Ahasuerus is Xerxes, and Xerxes is Ahasuerus. And here is Xerxes right here. Not a picture, but a depiction of him. And Xerxes he's an interesting fella. He's an okay emperor. He has a pretty good reign overall. He was a real builder. He built, he had some big building projects, I should say, including the completion of Persepolis, which is a city, to the southeast of Susa. Xerxes had some trouble within his empire. He faced several rebellions, including in places like Egypt and Babylon. He maintained Persia's vast network of satrapies, or what are provinces, but he failed when he tried to avenge his father's loss to the Greeks. And that's what we're going to talk about here in just a second. Xerxes' reign ended on kind of a bad note. He was assassinated and was succeeded by his son Artaxerxes I. So not a good end to his reign. So Esther chapter 1 introduces us to this man, Ahasuerus, who we call Xerxes. He holds this lavish 180-day celebration, followed by a 7-day feast for his nobles and officials. And as you read on in the story, he wants his queen to come into the party, to appear before his guests. We're told she's quite a striking woman, very beautiful, and he wants to show her off like he's been showing off the rest of his beautiful city of Susa. She refuses, and this makes him very angry. So, what he does is he deposes her. And the reasoning that's given here, I mean, this is one of those moments where we're like, okay, this is the way the world used to work. It doesn't work this way, I don't think, so much anymore, but he's advised by his counselors that he needs to put away his wife, because if he doesn't, then other Persian husbands are going to have problems with their wives. So he needs to make an example of her. Quite a peach of a guy, isn't he? Quite a peach of a guy. So he sends out this edict across the empire, declaring every man ruler in his own house. And I had a 6-hour trip today, so I listened to a couple different podcasts. I was listening to another one today. It was talking about just the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And one of the things I think the Old Testament helps us see is that there are certain ways of going about life that just aren't good. They're just not good. And this is one of those examples. And I think that's important because a lot of times we think Old Testament, it's in the Bible, this is the way we're supposed to go. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. And here's one prime example of that. Like, I don't think this was good, what he did in this situation. But he's the king, he's the emperor, and that's why our founding fathers saw fit to make our country a representative republic, right? Representative republic. Now, one of the things we see in this first chapter is another one of the weaknesses of the Persian Empire. We talked about how they had, for the most part, pretty terrible kings. We talked about their monumental military defeats, and we're going to get into that a little bit more here in just a second. But here's another reason why the Persians were such a weak empire in comparison to the Babylonians. They liked to party. They liked to party a little too much, and we see a glimpse of that here in the first chapter. You may not remember this quote, but when we talked about Daniel chapter 2, I read this quotation. This is from Will Durant's Our Oriental Heritage. He's talking about the Persian Empire in this time. Eating became the principal occupation of the aristocracy. These men who had once made it a rule to eat but once a day now interpreted the rule to allow them one meal, prolonged from noon to night. They stocked their larders with 1,000 delicacies and often served entire animals to their guests. They stuffed themselves with rich, rare meats and spent their genius upon new sauces and desserts. A corrupt and corrupting multitude of menials filled the houses of the wealthy, while drunkenness became the common vice of every class. It's Durant who says later on, I can't remember if it's in this book or if it's in a later book, he says, every civilization is born Stoic and dies Epicurean. And if you're familiar with those two philosophies, Stoicism is very much self-discipline, basically ordering your life, bringing order to your life, living a very disciplined life. Whereas Epicureanism is this whole philosophy of live it up, right? Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Don't deny yourself any pleasure. It's very hedonistic, okay? And I think what Durant is saying in this quote is basically that whole idea. This empire started out as Stoic, and it died Epicurean. It was giving into hedonism. And I think we get a glimpse of that in this account of Ahasuerus. All right, so we get into Esther chapter 2. Esther chapter 2. So Vashti has been deposed, and a search begins for a new queen. Many young women are brought to Susa, including Esther, whose Hebrew name is Hadassah. Esther is a Jewish orphan who's been raised by her cousin Mordecai, and she wins favor with Haggai, the harem's custodian. So, yeah, we're talking about a whole different culture, right? We're talking about her not just becoming the queen, but she's also going to be a part of the king's harem as well. Esther keeps her Jewish identity secret, as advised by Mordecai, and we're going to get into a little bit of why that might be the case. Mordecai says, don't tell people who your family is. Don't tell anybody your nationality. Keep that secret. Xerxes ends up choosing Esther as queen, and later on in the chapter, Mordecai uncovers a plot to assassinate King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus, and ends up saving the king. So that's kind of a prelude, a foreshadowing of how Ahasuerus' reign is going to end. And I think there's a pretty good reason why people were plotting to assassinate Ahasuerus. But I want to go down one quick little rabbit trail here that's kind of interesting. Okay, so this is Esther chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. This is talking about Mordecai and Esther, and we get a little bit of background as to what tribe they came from and their family lineage. In Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Now, a lot of names being thrown out at you here, and I don't know if you recognized any of those names, but they're actually an echo of a story we talked about a few months ago. In 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse number 1, we're introduced to Saul. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, from the family of Kish. Catch that? Sound familiar? Whose family does Mordecai and Esther come from? They come from the tribe of Benjamin, from the family of Kish. Then there's another name, this name Shimei. This comes up in the reign of King David. Now, when King David came to Bahurim, there was a man from the family of the house of Saul whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera, coming from there. He came out cursing continuously as he came. So there's a hypothesis out there. It was shared by some of the Jewish rabbis. They believe there was good reason to think that Mordecai and Esther are descendants of the royal household of Saul. So it's kind of interesting. So Esther's a queen, but in kind of a sense, she's got some royal blood running through her veins, if you will. I'm just throwing that out there as a possibility. I can't be absolutely certain about that, but it's going to come back here in a little bit in kind of an interesting way. All right. So let's read this section. This is verses 8 through 11. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken into the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. So she's won over the custodian of the king's harem. Okay? Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Now this part was really interesting to me. I'd not really thought about this until today. But I got to thinking, why was he so intent on making sure that Esther's identity was hidden? Why conceal her identity? Well, the Jews were a minority in this vast Persian Empire. We're pretty far removed at this point, 50 years removed from Cyrus the Great sending that first wave of Jews back to Jerusalem. So they're a minority within the empire, and, as a minority, they would be subject to prejudice or hostility. So if she concealed her identity, that could protect her from discrimination or harm at court. Also, if she concealed her identity, it would leave her options open, and she might be able to use that to her advantage at some point down the road. And if you kind of think about it, both of these make sense as you follow the story of Esther. Because she hid it for a time, and then she used it when it was to her and her people's advantage. All right? What else? Here's another possible reason why she hid it. The Persian royal court was multi-ethnic, but it favored assimilation. Basically, they didn't have a problem with people coming from different nations and making up the king's court. That wasn't the issue. But they expected you to conform. They expected you to become a part. They wanted you to fit in. So this was one way that Esther could fit in and could rise both socially and politically in court. So Mordecai is very shrewd, and I think he gives her excellent advice that really puts her in a position that when the time comes, she's able to do something substantial to help her people. All right, well, as we talked about a moment ago, Xerxes falls for Esther. He makes her his queen. She's taken to him into the royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now, here's where we get a little bit of crossover with what's happening in history. Xerxes' reign begins in 485 BC. Vashti was removed in year 3. So chapter 1 happens in 482 BC. But Esther is not made queen until year 7, which is in 478 BC. This is kind of an interesting little wrinkle that, if you know just a little bit of history, can give the story of Esther a little bit more depth. So Xerxes decides to avenge his father Darius's defeat in Greece. He leads the Persian army in an invasion of Greece. And Herodotus tells us it was 2.5 million Persians. More modern estimates put this as probably about 80 to 100,000 Persian soldiers. Just soldiers. That's not counting seamen, navy, people in the navy. And the Greeks had probably about 57,000. So all those Greek city-states, they all teamed up together. They pooled their resources. They had about 57,000 soldiers to fight against the Persian invading force. The Persians also brought 1,200 vessels, and this dwarfed the size of the Greek navy. All the Greek city-states pooled their resources again, and they were able to put together a navy of about 400 vessels. So Xerxes brings an army and a navy. He invades the Greek mainland, and he brings enough forces to make this happen. There should be no reason why he's defeated, except that he makes some blunders along the way and runs into some bad luck and also runs into some brilliant military minds. So he managed to capture and burn Athens, but there were 2 battles that happened on the same day. The Battle of Platae. Is it Platae or Platae? I don't know. Well, I'm in the ballpark, right? The Greek infantry basically just proves once again that it is far superior to anything that Persia can put in the field, and they inflict a severe defeat on the Persians. Meanwhile, on the exact same day, over at the Battle of Mycale, on the same day across the Aegean Sea, an allied navy, so this is all the pooled resources of the Greeks, an allied navy destroyed the remnants of the Persian navy. Now, Persia outnumbered them in terms of soldiers and in terms of navy. And Xerxes is sent home with his tail between his legs. He basically gets whipped and humiliated. So Esther just so happens to be made queen right after this humiliating defeat at the hands of the Greeks. Yes, Chad.
Is that the same war that Sparta had the 300?
Yep. Yeah, they started out with 5,000, but the last day they had 300, holding that pass at Thermopylae, right? Yeah, that's the same war. That's the battle that everybody knows because of the movie and because the story is just so amazing, right? I think the story goes, one man lived and escaped to tell what had happened. So yeah, same war. And Xerxes comes home and he remembers, oh yeah, I deposed Vashti. I need to find myself a queen. So all this kind of fits in maybe as Xerxes' way of comforting himself after a bad day at the office, a bad couple of years at the office. All right, Esther chapter 3. So in this chapter, we're introduced to Haman. Xerxes promotes Haman to a very powerful position. He tells everyone that Haman is to be honored. But Mordecai, for some reason, decides he's not going to bow down to Haman. He refuses to show Haman honor. This angers Haman. And Haman begins to plot, not just against Mordecai, but he begins to plot against all of the Jews. And he ends up convincing Xerxes to order all Jews in the entire empire to be put to death. So Haman is instigating a genocide against the Jewish people. Now, why did Mordecai refuse to bow to Haman? Here's that little wrinkle that I told you a minute ago. We were talking about Mordecai and Esther potentially coming from the bloodline of Saul. Here's where that comes back and has perhaps some interesting connections. So who is Haman? Well, Haman is introduced to us as the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. Who are the Agagites? Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 7 and 8, Saul attacks the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Haman is an Agagite. And I think, based upon that identification, Haman is probably an Amalekite, and he may very well be from the royal household of the Amalekites. He's called an Agagite. Okay, so this is kind of one of those cool little connections that can be easily overlooked if you're just reading through the story. But what you have is Mordecai, who's potentially a descendant of Saul, who was supposed to destroy the Amalekites, who refuses to bow down to Haman, who is an Amalekite. And what does Haman want to do? He wants to destroy all the Jews. So there's this really interesting layer, a few different layers here that are happening underneath the surface of the story. So Haman, as the chapter concludes, prepares to lead a genocide against the Jews. This leads us into chapter 4. Chapter 4, Mordecai and all the Jews, they hear about Haman's plot, and they begin fasting and mourning. They learn about the edict, and they know that they're in real trouble. Mordecai urges Esther, Esther, you're a queen, you're in a position to do something about this, do something to save your people. But Esther is afraid, and rightly so. Esther is afraid for her life because if she approaches the king uninvited, she can be put to death. So she has to be in a place where the king invites her into his presence and wants her to be around. So she resolves to visit the king and asks the Jews to fast with her for 3 days. And I think probably the best 2 verses in the entire book of Esther are in Esther chapter 4. And it's in this message that Mordecai sends to Esther. He says, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" So Mordecai's message to her is, if you think you're going to get out of that palace alive, you're just fooling yourself. And your family line will end. So if you stay silent, that's not going to get you anywhere. And then he makes this statement. He says, if you stay silent, the Jews will be delivered by someone else in some other way. But Mordecai also says to her, maybe you've been put in this position for this very reason. And what we see in this statement is the idea of providence. What's interesting about the book of Esther is not once does it ever mention the name of God. God is never mentioned in the entire book of Esther. And yet, in Mordecai's statement, you have implied this idea of providence. And just so we understand what providence means, it means that God works in human affairs, human interactions. He orchestrates things in order to accomplish his will. He uses the choices and the decisions that people make in order to work these things together. And it's an interesting topic to study and to think about. So Mordecai basically says to her, if you stay silent, God will find a way. God will find a way to deliver his people. He doesn't say God, but that's what he means. The Jews will find a way to be delivered. God will deliver them. And then he says, maybe this is the reason why you're the queen. And that's something good to think about. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations and we ask ourselves, why me? Why am I in this situation? Why have I been put in this position? This doesn't seem fair. Well, it's good to remember the words of Mordecai in those moments. Maybe we're the right person in the right place at the right time. Maybe we're in that place for just such a moment. It's something to think about. I don't know that we can say that with certainty in every situation we run into, but I think whenever you find yourself in a difficult, challenging circumstance, maybe it's God's way of putting you in that place for that moment. In my experience, it's a little bit easier to determine that after things have happened. Usually when you're in the moment, it's kind of cloudy enough, the fog of war, so to speak. It's difficult to see things clearly, but looking back, you can often see that I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And maybe, just maybe, God put me there. I think it's quite possible. Well, I'll leave the lesson with you tonight, and I kind of combined 2 lessons, and I'm going to kind of combine the second half. Well, I'm going to combine 2 other lessons. We're going to do Esther in 2 lessons as opposed to 3. So, yeah, Darrell, go ahead.
I thought it was interesting about the king and the advice of keep the women in their place.
Yeah.
And Rehoboam, he asked the old men and the young men advisors about whether being more harsh or less harsh, and he took the advice of the young men. And we need to, I just think there's maybe a lesson there for us about who our counselors are and who we listen to.
100%.
And so they may have been bad people, but they got bad advice. And they chose that advice.
Yeah.
That they were wrong. I just think it's interesting.
And nobody remembers the names of the counselors. No. But they all remember the name of Rehoboam. and Xerxes, right? Everybody remembers those names, the people that made the decision. But you're absolutely right. The people we seek advice out, we need to be careful who we make our advisors.
And of course, we would believe that we should be praying for guidance, and we should be looking, searching the scriptures for guidance too.
Yeah.
Which is a little different than what they were doing, but they did listen to different ones, Moses and Joseph, and there was some good examples.
Oh yeah.
But usually, just the counselors in general sometimes gave bad advice.
Yeah. Well, and you think of Moses' father-in-law, who gave him great advice.
Yes.
You kind of need to delegate some of these responsibilities, or you're going to run yourself ragged.
Exactly.
And that's not good. So yeah, then there are those examples when you see a guy give good advice. And there's a proverb that says something to the effect of, in the multitude of counselors, wisdom can be found.
I was trying to
Something
find
like that. Yeah, it's something like that. That's a paraphrase.
That's right. It's a multitude of counselors.
Yeah, multitude of counselors. Yeah. Always good to get advice from 2 or 3 people if you're facing a decision that you just don't feel like you've got your arms wrapped around. So, or maybe if you do have your arms, you feel like you have your arms wrapped around it, maybe you do need to ask for advice. Well, we'll close there and extend the gospel invitation. What song do you have picked out there, Don?
Into our hands.
Into Our Hands.
744.
Yeah. That's I always find that to be a convicting song, because it reminds us that life is brief, life is short. There are people out there who are searching for the truth, searching for God. And some people are just searching for something and they don't even know what they're looking for. So it's good for us to remember that every day is an opportunity. Every time we interact with someone, it's an opportunity to talk about the gospel, talk about Jesus, talk about the Bible. And if you invite people to church and they don't come, just keep inviting them. Most people, it takes like 7 invitations to church before people will come. I saw a study many years ago to that effect. So, just keep sowing that seed. Keep watering, keep fertilizing. And remember, we have this responsibility, but ultimately, the power is in God's hands. He's the one who convicts people. He's the one who brings them to faith. He's the one who does all the heavy lifting. We're just the ones who carry the message. So it's a good song. Let's stand and sing.
Swiftly we're turning life's daily pages. It started for me, wait. Swiftly we're turning. 744.
Yeah, we're out of books over here.
Oh.
Swiftly we're turning life's daily pages. Swiftly the hours are changing to years. How are we using God's golden moments? Shall we reap glory? Shall we reap tears? Into our hands the gospel is given. Into our hands is given the light. Haste, let us carry God's precious message, guiding the erring back to the right. Millions are groping without the gospel. Quickly they'll reach eternity's night. Shall we sit idly as they rush onward? Haste, let us hold up Christ the true light. Into our hands the gospel is given. Into our hands is given the light. Haste, let us carry God's precious message, guiding the erring back to the right. Souls that are precious, souls that
not also die for these lost ones? Then let us point the way unto heaven. Into our hands the gospel is given. Into our hands is given the light. Haste, let us carry God's precious